They warred. Dr. Dask caught herself lost in thought for what was not the first time that day. The humans were definitely up to something. She paced around her room on the outer rim of the lunar facility, built after the previous orbital station was deemed irredeemably outdated by modern standards. If she'd learned anything in her 20 Earth years studying the people on the blue planet, it was that they didn't seem to go without a major war for very long. There were, of course, smaller conflicts and skirmishes all across the planet, as had become routine, but this extended peace, which had lasted her whole career by this point, must have meant something was off. Some of her xenosociologist peers theorized that the humans must have, at last, realized how pointless their model of constant bloodshed was and adopted the civilized model of war, as indicated by the increase in their industrial capacities as well as the strengthening of their militaries despite the times of peace. Surely, her fellow scientists argued, this meant that the weapons were starting to be used as a tool of intimidation, rather than destruction and death. The scientist thought the idea of a civilized model of war was stupid and inherently contradictory. Alas, those assertions were not the main issue she had with their theory. If humans had had a sudden realization about the horrors they were committing on a daily basis, why were there still so many conflicts all around the world? Not only that, but the weapons they were testing didn't seem to be for the sole purpose of shock and awe. Of particular note was when she caught a glimpse of an artillery gun, a weapon designed to launch high-speed projectiles upwards and relying on the planet's high gravity to bring them down into enemy lines, launching what seemed to be a regular projectile, until it fell on the ground and, rather than exploding, released a large amount of yellow-brownish gas, which surely couldn't scare the most cowardly of bandits, let alone a human. She did not know what the purpose of it was, but it definitely unsettled her. Regardless, almost all of their developments seemed to be about killing each other, but better, and even the most impractical of technologies, namely zeppelins, as the humans called the hulking, and very flammable, masses floating above their cities, were being weaponized in one way or another, for a purpose still shrouded in Dask's eyes. "Dr. Dask?" asked a meek voice, entering her room as she was still pacing around, deep in thought. The scientists currently stationed at the observatory seem to think large amounts of troops are mobilizing. "Ma'am, you may want to see this." That pulled the scientist right out of her mental state, and she headed to the observatory as fast as she could walk before it would be considered a full-blown run. "Thank you, Rayleigh," she said, directed at the junior scientist who was struggling to keep up behind her. "This may be the answer I've been seeking for so long. We may find what they've been doing for all these years," she said, finally finding herself in the confines of the observatory room. The researcher tried to keep her excitement in check. Whatever was happening, she thought, would definitely involve the deaths of thousands of sapients, as was so terribly common when human militaries got involved with something. She watched, in unabashed curiosity, as armies made of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of humans marched across the land, wielding the deadliest and most advanced weapons they had so far been able to grasp. This was, by far, the largest army she had ever seen. There were records of larger ones being deployed, sure, but being able to personally witness the sheer scale of such a war was truly astounding. They were still only in the mobilization phase, however, and as such the doctor furiously took some notes and headed to the cafeteria for dinner, which had an extravagant window giving a beautiful view of Earth. The decommissioned space station also had one, and, when the new lunar base was inaugurated, the older scientists felt quite salty about losing their favorite lookout spot and demanded that a new one be built. By the end of the month, human calendar, however, her cautioned curiosity had already turned into sheer terror. Fighting had broken out all across the world, the brutality of the newly developed weapons unmatched by anything she or any of her older colleagues had ever witnessed. Some of the proponents of the human enlightenment theory had locked themselves in their rooms, not being able to bear the sorrow of knowing that they could not have been any more wrong if they tried. This continued on for untold days and weeks, casualties piling up on every side of the conflict, both soldier and civilian, in enough numbers to collapse any reasonable alien society. The humans, however, fought on, seemingly unfazed. After a few months, as the fighting still raged on from the thickest of jungles to the hottest of deserts, the main front, in the continent containing the nations who first started the war, seemed to come to a standstill. Dask, now significantly more disheveled than she was those sweet months ago before such a massively important event broke out, felt a glimmer of hope. Surely this stalemate would mean the beginning of negotiations, and a possible end to what could only be described as the worst conflict anyone in the outpost had ever witnessed. The scientist and her colleagues were watching as both sides dug long, sinuous corridors across a field. This, she thought, would force them into peace. No army, not even a human one, would want to get stuck in such an unwinnable situation, where neither side can reliably attack each other without catastrophic losses on both sides. The group gawked. Some of the humans along the battlefield had suddenly stopped fighting, even climbing into disputed territory, seemingly mingling with those who were their enemies just a few hours prior. This was, as Dask noted, shocked, probably the most human behavior she'd ever seen. From a senseless bloodbath to camaraderie and care almost instantly. It further fueled her hopes of a peaceful resolution in the end, as clearly such a display of friendship together with the hopelessness of their military positions would be enough to make both sides come to their senses. Later reports would note that this truce may have had something to do with the end of the solar year, an occasion celebrated by nearly all humans for as far as Commonwealth records go. The armistice, though, did not last long. By the next day, it might as well have never happened, much to the chagrin of the researchers, still hanging on to the slim hope that this would end soon, if not by collaboration then by hopelessness alone. That, however, was not the case. It had been roughly 5, human calendar, months since the seemingly random act of peace. Hundreds of thousands more had died, and at this point, Dask believed the humans couldn't actually grasp the scale of what they were doing, especially given how mysterious the actual reasons for the war still were to her. What unfathomable offense had been made for it to spark such slaughter? She did not have the answers. All she knew is that the humans did not seem at all inclined to back down. By this point, their weapons were only one of the many sources of death and sorrow in this war. Disease ran rampant, with no proper medical facilities on the front lines, and a lack of supplies meant that several thousands simply starved to death, not a single bullet needing to be fired to cause their demise. The mood on the research team was somber. The war had been dragging on, and Dr. Dask wondered just how many sleepless nights were yet to come, for she couldn't truly rest while such terrible acts were taking place so close by. The silver lining, if you could call it that, is that she'd grown somewhat jaded to human warfare, and it did not make her as nauseated as it should, and as it did in the past. Until the shells hit. As Dask watched, projectiles came down from the sky on a human trench, though, unlike the explosions she'd grown accustomed to, they simply released large amounts of a brownish-yellow gas, which she remembered seeing all those months ago, being tested. Once it dissipated enough to see through, she understood its true purpose, and immediately wished she hadn't. Hundreds of humans, twitching, coughing, vomiting, their skins burnt despite the absence of fire, some of them eerily still, choked out by the gas that had displaced the air on the long dirt corridors. She stared, in shock, as the other side began charging, putting on masks that deprived them of all human features and walking into the dying lines, immune to the effects of the deadly gas. They mercilessly killed anyone and everyone wearing the wrong uniform, even those already on the floor. She thought about that in contrast to that serene night in which they mingled. It was hardly believable that they were of the same species, let alone the same people altogether. Vomit filled the observatory. The other researchers, like Dr. Dask herself, thought they were used to human antics at this point, but their ingenuity when it comes to cruelty once again proved to be unrivaled. Most others left the room, leaving the dirty work to the cleaning bots. Dr. Dask did not vomit, if for no other reason than that she had not yet eaten, and as such physically could not do so. She also returned to her room, no longer feeling even the remotest scientific curiosity to watch such a terrible event unfold. Over the next several years, the war dragged on and on, mountains upon mountains of bodies piling up, the count in the millions by now, civilians included. The clothes were stripped from the dead, washed anew and given to a young, excited recruit, just for them to meet the same fate, and repeat the cycle once more. Morale among the researchers was at an all-time low, many choosing to no longer accompany the fighting as closely, and some retiring from the facility entirely. The humans, of course, did not care much for the emotions of aliens they didn't even know the existence of, and as such only got more and more creative with their machinations, from flying machines strapped with bombs and guns, to a brand new vehicle named the tank, which was, by all means, a marvel of engineering for their civilization, albeit prone to constant breakdowns. All that to fuel a war which Dr. Dask was still unsure as to the cause. Dr. Dask herself, albeit far worse for wear than she had been before this, kept going. While the overwhelming cruelty was evident, she could not simply ignore the random glimmers offered by the various and random acts of kindness she had seen across the war. From the truce on that night, to a random soldier helping an injured enemy combatant, to humans risking their own life and walking into the line of fire to rescue their comrades. That's why, when the day of the armistice finally came, she was one of the few left from the original team still there to witness it, and, as soldiers disbanded and went home, she could only look across the cafeteria window and into the blue marble above, wondering if this troubled species could ever truly achieve peace and step into the galactic stage as new allies, rather than pariahs. The end.